rules. The committee will continue to provide accommodations for members who request to participate in hearings virtually. But I'm very happy to have the vast majority of our members and our witness participating in person here today. As a reminder, those who are not fully vaccinated must continue to wear a mask in the hearing room and practice social distancing. But I would also like to encourage our members to continue wearing masks if they feel more comfortable doing so. And so, members, we have a little bit of a problem with our timing apparatus here this morning. We can see the timing here when your 5 minutes are up. Our witness can see her 5 minutes. And of course, it will be monitored by our friends on the opposite side of the aisle. So we will make sure that we are all in sync with the timing. Let me just say that I'm going to be very strict with the timing. If you take all of your 5 minutes to ask the question and then expect the secretary to answer for another 2 or 3 minutes, that won't happen today. After 5 minutes, you will be gavelled. So thank you. This hearing is entitled Building Back a Better, More Equitable Housing Infrastructure for America, Oversight of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. First of all, a happy good morning, Secretary Fudge. I'm so delighted to have you with us today to discuss the work that the Biden administration is doing to build a more fair, equitable, and accessible housing infrastructure in this country. I want to begin by applauding you and the Biden administration for treating our housing crisis with the urgency and seriousness it deserves. The Trump administration made it crystal clear that it didn't appreciate the magnitude of our nation's housing crisis by repeatedly proposing deep budget cuts to HUD programs and taking action to undermine our fair housing laws. The Trump administration showed a complete disregard for low and moderate income families, people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, and immigrants. It's only because of Democrats in Congress that HUD's budget was not decimated during Trump's presidency. Because elections matter, President Biden and HUD have now begun to reverse Trump's anti-fair housing rules. Democrats on this committee also remain laser focused on ensuring that eligible families receive the housing assistance available to them through the CARES Act, the December relief package, the American Rescue Plan, and other coronavirus relief legislation. And so we must remember, however, that we're not just building back our economy from the pandemic and Donald Trump's disastrous housing policies. We're building back better, and that's my focus for today's hearing. Key to building back better and more equitably is understanding that housing is infrastructure. For the first time in a generation, we have a real opportunity to fix structural problems in our housing system and reverse decades of disinvestment in low-income communities and communities of color. So last week, I and several members of this committee introduced a legislative package of 3 bills to do just that. One is first, the Housing is Infrastructure Act. Second is the Ending Homelessness Act. And the third is the Down Payment Toward Equity Act that would help access to address the racial gap and home ownership gaps by providing $100 billion toward down payment and other financial assistance for first-generation home buyers. We must make housing a top priority. These generational investments will increase home ownership, provide a permanent housing safety structure, and end homelessness in this country once and for all. So, Secretary Fudge, I know you're the right person to take advantage of this moment. Thank you so much for your leadership on this absolutely critical issue. I look forward to your testimony today. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for holding today's hearing. Secretary Fudge, welcome. Nice to see you in your first appearance before Congress on that side of the table. It has a different perspective. I must begin today by asking where is Treasury Secretary Yellen? I sent the chair a letter last week asking the Treasury Secretary join us for today's hearing, but it looks like they couldn't make that happen. Maybe Secretary Fudge can shed some light on the most pressing issue in housing at the moment for the federal government, and that is in regards to the rental assistance program. I know millions of renters across the country and across the income spectrum would like some answers. Look, Madam Chair, we're on a deadline. The Biden administration's eviction moratorium ends on July 31st. The CDC has already said no more extensions. So what are people supposed to do? What is the plan? Last December, Congress provided $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. Democrats then added another $21 billion this year for the exact same purpose. That is $46 billion. This might not sound like a lot of money, considering what the Democrats are talking about and spending $3.5 trillion on the progressive agenda with the next budget. But I assure you, if the Americans who have to decide next month whether they want food for their family or to pay back rent, it certainly is. This money was specifically intended to retire old rent debts and end the threat of eviction for millions who fell behind during the pandemic. So where is that money and who is it helping? The silence is deafening. The Washington Post reported over the weekend that little more than $1 billion has made it out the door. And I'll remind my colleagues again, we've allocated $46 billion to help with this rental problem. Republicans on this committee have put forward a solution, the Renter Protection Act. This bill would end the Biden administration's mismanagement of the emergency rental assistance and get the money out the door now. Last week, I called for the committee to consider this bill, but the chair hasn't scheduled it or anything like it for a markup. Okay, so what about this hearing? What about a hearing? We are days away from a preventable problem, and instead of figuring out how to keep families in their homes, we're going to get an update from HUD on all the other stuff on a forward-looking basis they're working on. This is government at its worst. It's clear Democrats would rather talk about anything but the rental assistance program and resolving old rental debts. Not to mention, with this level of mismanagement and lack of transparency, I can only imagine the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars we'll have to address. But lucky for us, we have no information. So hear no evil, see no evil, I guess, is the approach right now. Fortunately for this hearing, HUD has a statutory obligation with respect to transparency of these funds. The original emergency rental assistance law requires that the Treasury Department, quote, in consultation with the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who we have before us today, is to provide public reports on the use of the emergency rental assistance program. So while I would prefer to ask these questions to Secretary Yellen because they are supposed to be in the driver's seat of Treasury, Madam Secretary, I'll direct them to you. And my questions here regard the mismanagement of this program and why less than 4% has gone to help renters. 96% has been unallocated. So where is the Treasury Secretary? I'll ask that again. I look forward to the questions.
I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me begin where you began this committee early on, and that was with your almost holy housing obsession, particularly on affordable housing. So thank you very much. The country, I think, is moving in that direction. I'd also like to thank my dear friend, Secretary Fudge, for not only being with us today, but for taking the time this past May to visit Kansas City to discuss the vital role that HUD has in every one of our congressional districts. Secretary Fudge is, in fact, listening. She is taking bold action, and in her commitment to improving the department and the quality of life for hard-working Americans is unquestionable. Madam Chair, we know that we do not need another study. I hope that There's no legislation designed to study housing. We do not need another news article to tell us that the wealthiest nation on earth have streets filled with homeless folk. We do not need another report to explain the American dream of homeownership. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate our friend and former colleague, Secretary Fudge, appearing before us today. But I have to reinforce the comments made by the ranking member about the noticeable lack of Secretary Yellen. I can't help but mention how available Secretary Mnuchin made himself over the 4 years in office, and particularly for this committee during the pandemic. And I hope we can expect that from the Biden administration. It's imperative to have Secretary Yellen here to ensure accountability for the trillions of dollars the government has spent over the last year. Alarmingly, only 11% of the $9 billion provided to HUD by the CARES Act has been spent to date, and none of the American Rescue Plan money has been used to help an actual household yet. Even more concerning is the gross mismanagement of the eviction rental assistance program. In my home state of Arkansas, of the $200 million allocated by Congress in December, a mere 1.4 million, 70 basis points, has been distributed. I look forward to discussing this more during my questions, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome today's distinguished witness and former colleague of ours, the Honorable Marcia Fudge, who is the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is Secretary Fudge's first time appearing before this committee in her current capacity, and we welcome her testimony today. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You should be able to see a timer on the table in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. I would ask you to be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears so quickly, wrap up your testimony so that we can be respectful of the committee members' time. Secretary Fudge, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you so very much. Good morning. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of this committee, many of my friends, and I miss you. It's good to see you. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the transformational investments the Biden-Harris administration has proposed to advancing housing opportunity in America. I know President Biden is committed in his head and in his heart to help more people find a stable, affordable, and dignified place to call home. He has made that commitment clear. The President's proposed budget for fiscal year 2022 requests $68.7 billion for HUD. This represents an increase of $9 billion, or 15%, from our enacted funding from the previous fiscal year. The American people need every dollar in this budget. Today, it is harder to find an affordable home in America than at any point since the 2008 financial crisis. The high cost of housing keeps millions of families up every night. They wonder if they can afford to keep a roof over their head and still manage to keep their lights on, to pay for their prescriptions, or to put foods on their tables. The President's budget takes bold action to address our affordable housing crisis and to dramatically strengthen our social safety net for the most vulnerable among us. The President's budget requests $3.5 billion to provide housing and supportive services to Americans experiencing homelessness, including young people and survivors of domestic violence. It contains $30.4 billion for HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program. If enacted, it would deliver life-changing assistance to an additional 200,000 households. The President understands that investing in housing represents a major solution for advancing equity on behalf of underserved Americans. The President's budget requests $723 million in Indian Housing Block Grants to create affordable housing and spark economic development on tribal lands. It contains $3.8 billion in Community Development Block Grants, including $295 million in targeted funding for historically underserved areas in cities, small towns, and rural communities. Nearly half of our public housing stock is more than 50 years old. Many properties face significant capital needs. This is not just a safety issue, but an issue of racial justice. as Americans of color represent roughly 70% of people living in public housing. The President's budget provides $3.2 billion in capital funds to help restore public housing and to improve the quality of life for the residents we serve. We know people of color are especially vulnerable to the threats posed by climate change and extreme weather. We are 3 times as likely to live in areas which lack green infrastructure that helps guard against flooding. Too often, we find ourselves in the path of natural disasters and are denied the resources we need to rebuild our homes and our communities. That is why President Biden provides $800 million to strengthen climate resilience in public housing on tribal lands and across HUD-supported communities. The President's 2022 budget is just one part of his commitment to make generational investments into America's housing. In addition to the vital support contained in his budget, the President has called for sweeping new housing investments through his Build Back America agenda. These investments would help build or restore more than 2 million affordable homes. The Build Back Better agenda would help more families of modest means realize the dream of homeownership. It would expand our supply of affordable rental housing and help revitalize our public housing stock. Our nation must move with urgency to enact investments contained in both the President's budget and his Build Back Better agenda. During the COVID-19 crisis, we all came to appreciate just how important it is to have a safe and stable place to call home. Today, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, our country is making great strides in rebuilding from the pandemic. Our economy is surging, more Americans continue to get vaccinated, life is beginning to feel closer to normal. Yet America cannot return to the status quo of yesterday, prior to the pandemic. We must not return to an America beset by crumbling homes and buildings, to an America grappling with a crisis in affordable housing. We must build back better together. I look forward to partnering with this committee to help make housing for all a reality in our nation and to ensure that HUD acts as a responsible steward for the funding entrusted to us. And with that, Madam Chair, I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Since I joined this committee 3 decades ago, I've been consistently focused on homelessness, not just managing it, but ending this national embarrassment for one of the richest nations in the world. As you know, homelessness is also a racial justice issue. Despite representing less than 30% of the total population, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx individuals make up well over 2/3 of the people experiencing homelessness in America. Once again, they fall into homelessness. They are also far less likely than their white counterparts to be able to access the health and mental health services they need to obtain and maintain housing. Just last week, a team at the Urban Institute, led by Mary Cunningham, who previously testified before this committee on my Ending Homelessness Act, conducted a study on the effectiveness of permanent supportive housing in interrupting the costly cycle of chronic homelessness. In a randomized trial, participants in a Denver supportive housing initiative reduced their arrest and emergency room visits by 40% relative to the comparison group and more effectively addressed their health needs, including such as with doctor's office visits and prescriptions. So, Secretary Fudge, you and I have talked about this endlessly, all during the time that we've served here. And I know how you feel about homelessness. And I know that we had a conversation more than once about supportive services. And of course, we know that with supportive services, we're able to get people like more independent. If we can help them get to the doctor, if we can help them make sure they take their prescriptions and all of that. And so I think it is important for us to talk about supportive services, kind of what that means as we deal with this homelessness issue. Because as we talk about, additional affordable units and rental assistance and all that, we know that to the degree that we're able to assist people take hold of their daily lives with not only taking care of doctor's appointments and all of that, but being able to get up every day and maybe do everything from exercise to read, to go to the local library, what have you, that this would go a long way in helping them to become independent. So how do you feel about supportive services and what that could mean in terms of the way that we look at homelessness?
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, if we don't do supportive services, Madam Chair, what we do is really set up people to fail. Once we get people off the streets, and you know as well as I do that on any night in America, more than 580,000 people in this country, the greatest nation in the world, have no place to sleep. And so until we can start to provide those services, whether it be health services, whether it be educational services, access to work, access to transportation, and a myriad of other things, we really have not done much because we have not given them the tools and the ability to live on their own successfully.
I know we absolutely agree on that issue. Let me just say a word about this rental assistance that the ranking member talked about. We passed the HEROES Act in June and again in October. We also passed the standalone version of the Emergency Rental Assistance Bill in July. It wasn't until December that Republicans came to the table to help us pass emergency rental assistance. So it's very interesting that Republicans are now complaining about delays in implementation. We would have been much further along in the implementation if Republicans had not dragged their feet in acknowledging the problem from the start. And they can't be more worried about it than I am. That's my issue. That's the issue that I put the most time on. And yes, I added additional money after we had done the CARES money into the American Relief Plan. So we know that we have a problem all over this country. I know that Secretary Yellen and you, everybody's concerned about that. We're doing everything we can to get the states to do what they should do in putting together the programs that they need to do to get the rental assistance out. So I just wanted to say that as I end and turn the time over to Mr. McHenry. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for talking about the same thing that I think we all care about. We've allocated $46 billion we had to rental assistance. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program was supported by both parties when the law finally got passed. And when Secretary Yellen was here in March, she pledged that she would come back and before this committee to explain what was going on. And so, according to the documents from Treasury, less than 4% of the money provided by Congress has reached eligible households. So, Secretary Fudge, can you tell us how much of the $46 billion in rental assistance has ended up in the hands of renters or their landlords at this point?
Well, certainly I cannot speak for Secretary Yellen, but I will give you the facts as I know them. I'd be happy to do it. What I do know is that Treasury has obligated 100% of the resources from emergency rental. It is in the hands of states, local communities, and some continuums of care. So the resources are out. It is not a matter of the fact that Treasury didn't get it out. 100% of the resources are out. What we are doing now to assist.
How many are in the hands of renters?
Sir, I have no idea, but I would say this to you.
So is the Washington Post story correct that it's
I've
just
not
over
read
$1
it.
billion? Were you familiar with the Washington Post story I referenced from the weekend?
But I've not read the story, sir, so I don't know if it's accurate or not.
Okay, so you're saying the funds are allocated, but you're not sure if it's been gotten in the hands of anyone.
Well, I know it has gotten in the hands of some people. I don't know that number.
Is that knowable from government, or is it, I'm not trying to play a pop quiz on you and testifying, but you are under law statutorily consulted by the Treasury Secretary for this program. And since she is not appearing, and this is a very pressing issue, I think we have a right to know why only 4% is actually gotten in the hands of eligible households. Is that a correct number?
As I said, sir, I don't know if it is or not.
So we
what I
don't
do
know,
know-
we don't know if it's $1 billion, less, more, of the $46 billion.
HUD does not track the resources, sir.
Well, statutorily, we will follow up with you on that comment, because statutorily you are required to publish the data about ERA.
In consultation with Treasury.
Yes, but HUD is the one to publish the report.
in
statutorily
consultation.
under ERA. So Section 501G of Division N of Public Law 116-260, which created the original ERA program. Are you familiar with it? It reads, reporting requirements. The Treasury Secretary, in consultation with the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, shall provide public reports not less frequently than quarterly regarding the use of funds made available under this act. So the last report says only 4% has gotten in the hands of renters. And do you dispute that?
I don't know if it's accurate or not, so no, I do not dispute it.
Are you familiar with the report that your department published?
Yes.
And in that report, it says less than 4% has gotten in the hands of renters.
The numbers change every day, sir.
Okay, but you have no idea if they're what those numbers are at this moment.
I do not.
Okay, so given the statutory obligation, can you tell us what action HUD is taking to make sure that we get help in the hands of these renters faster? What are you doing to make that faster with Secretary Yellen?
We are the people that are providing the technical assistance. And I would say to you,
What technical assistance are you providing to get it out of the door faster? Is this an urgent issue for your department?
it is.
What are you doing to make it faster?
We are talking to the communities that are the people that have the least capacity to use the resources. So we are helping small and rural communities. We are helping small and rural communities to get the resources from their states and from their county and other local governments through the housing trust funds, et cetera, because most of them do not have the capacity. We give them money, but we don't give them people. We don't give them
You
enough
spent
capacity to
$800
handle.
million on overhead for this program to distribute just over $1 billion.
But they don't go to the rural communities, sir.
But understand, what has been spent by this administration is almost the same amount in overhead as actually gotten in the hands of renters. That is how deeply flawed this program is. Now, this is something that requires, I think, your attention and Secretary Yellen's attention. This is an absolute, it looks like complete mismanagement at this point when you only have less than 4% of the money getting in the hands of renters for this very important program.
Let me just, if I may, sir, let me just first off, we did make a mistake. Treasury actually publishes the report, not HUD. We consult with them. That's number one.
The gentleman's time has expired, and this program is overseen by Ms. Yellen, the Treasury. When she's before us, then these questions will be
And that's why I
appropriately
raised the
answered.
question to
The
invite the
gentleman from
Secretary of
California,
Treasury
Mr.
here.
Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Fudge, honored to have you here, thrilled to say the word Secretary Fudge. And I can think of, it's so appropriate that you are our sole witness here for this hearing. And I can think of no better use of the committee's time than to hear directly and solely from you in this hearing. The first question is something I'd just like you to respond for the record. Our colleague, Salud Carbajal, has a bill, the Naomi Schwartz Safe Parking Program Act. And I want to thank the chairwoman for noticing that bill for this hearing. And it focuses on those who are sleeping in their cars, the vehicular homeless. And I hope that you'd respond for the record as to whether we can do more to help people who are sleeping in their cars. Happens especially in Southern California. And particularly you and your staff could take a look at the Naomi Schwartz Safe Parking Program Act. I'd now like to focus on Section 8, which is so important to Southern California. People get the Section 8 voucher, but then they can't find a landlord in my district who will accept it. Senators Coons and Kramer have a bill, the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. But I hear the story all the time. People end up moving 50, 30 miles away from my district because they can't find a landlord. And I don't represent that wealthy a district. So do you think that we can and should do more to incentivize landlord participation in the Section 8 program?
Absolutely. And let me just say, if I may, Mr. Sherman, that the $46 billion is needed. There has never been anyone who can say people who are homeless or at risk of experiencing homelessness don't need the money. If there's a problem on the federal side, that is not their problem. The resources are needed every day to get people on the street. In California, most people can't afford to live in California anymore. And so the homelessness problem is so great there because even if we can find a landlord who is willing to rent to someone who is getting a Section 8 voucher, they can get so much more money from someone else. And so there is such a small supply for such a great demand.
Thank you. Members of the committee know that I've been concerned with these PACE loans because you have a first mortgage on your home, and then the PACE loan comes in as in effect, a firster or ahead of the first mortgage. And that can pose a threat to federal programs like FHA that guarantee first mortgages. But I'm also concerned because, as the National Consumer Law Center says, these products are frequently expensive loans that are often pushed by aggressive contractors for projects which provide questionable savings and pose serious risks of predatory lending. That's why I want to thank the chairwoman for noticing for this hearing my bill, the Improving Federal Oversight of PACE Financing Act, and to thank the National Consumer Law Center for endorsing that bill. Madam Secretary, would you agree that we need to take more steps to protect consumers and the federal mortgage guarantee and assistance programs when it comes to these predatory PACE loans?
Well, I don't know that I would agree to it being predatory, but I would say that I do believe.
Some of them are predatory, and some are not predatory. I want to make that clear. There are some
agree.
that are quite legitimate, but they come in above the
I absolutely agree. We need to have more conversations, further discussions, and look at it to be sure that it truly is providing a source of affordable financing. Yes, I agree.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and welcome our former colleague, now Madam Secretary Fudge. First, and I think you're going to hear this from all of us because we are just deeply, deeply disappointed and frustrated that Treasury Secretary Yellen is not testifying today. And I know you're going to take a number of questions from us based on the joint efforts between HUD and Treasury. The Treasury Department has failed to properly administer more than $46 billion with a B in rental assistance to struggling families. And frankly, Madam Secretary, the taxpayers in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District deserve more accountability and transparency than what we are seeing from the Biden administration. Congress has appropriated this money for families facing the threat of eviction, but less than 4%, as we're going to hear over and over again, of the rental assistance funds have actually reached eligible households. It is unacceptable that Secretary Yellen is not appearing before this committee when time is so urgent. We've got 2 weeks before expiration. She should be here today to answer for the mismanagement of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. $46 billion and less than 4% reaching those who need it. Secretary Fudge, outside of Treasury's emergency rental assistance programs, HUD received tens of billions in community development block grants and homeless assistance grants from the CARES Act, 2 different programs almost a year and a half ago. And frankly, the vast majority of which remains unspent. Only 12.3% of the $5 billion in the CARES CDBG funds have yet been spent by grantees, while only 9.4% of homeless assistance grants in the CARES Act have been spent. What is this money that's in your jurisdiction, Madam Secretary? Why are these funds delayed from reaching those who need it the most?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. HUD has actually obligated, which means we have given to grantees more than 93% of all CARES money. Part of the problem with the CARES money is that as communities receive the CARES money and then they receive the COVID money, the rescue money, what they determined was the CARES money is the money that needed more planning, that gave them a longer period of time to spend. And so what they basically said was, let's spend the emergency money right away. CARES money, we want to take the time to actually plan so that no one will accuse them of waste, fraud, and abuse, which we do often when people harshly and hastily spend federal resources. So they are in the planning phase. They have almost 4 years left on CARES dollars. So those are the dollars they're using last, but they do have it.
But the need is so great right now, Madam Secretary. And so let me get to my second question here, which is, I think, a reflection of what we've seen with this patchwork quilt of different rental assistance programs. There's been a lot said about the ability and inability of certain jurisdictions to build 2, 3, 4 different emergency rental assistance programs and keep track of all the money with so many competing rules and timelines. And much of this, I think, has to do with the rules that have been set out that are so onerous and that are not being properly administered by our federal agencies and oversought by our federal agencies at both HUD and Treasury. So there's competing rules and timelines. Given the limited experience and expertise of certain localities, wouldn't it be easier to run if there was only one consolidated program with one rule set?
Well, I don't know that it would be easier. It depends on what the rules would be. But I would certainly suggest to you that most communities are accustomed to dealing with HUD. They get most of their technical assistance, even though Congress decided to send the money through Treasury. Communities are accustomed to dealing with HUD.
But we've sent a
when
lot
we are
through
working
HUD
together-
too, Madam Secretary.
I'm sorry?
We've sent a lot through HUD also, but
And our
much of it,
our resources are out, Ms. Wagner.
well, but they're not being spent at the local level. Those rules, that rule set, that oversight, that accountability comes back up through your agency. So I'm not sure if my time is expiring. I haven't been watching. How much time? I do. Well, I would just say anything we can do to try and streamline this progress, to get the money to both the renters and the landlords that are suffering right now is what needs to be done. Not 4 years from now, right now. So I will yield back. I'm sure I've used the.
And I would agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to deal just for a second with this question about Yellen as opposed to Secretary Fudge and HUD. No, I did not invite her to intrude on the first time that this secretary would appear before us. And I don't intend to treat women that way. And so, no, Yellen is not here. She'll be here when quarterly time is due, and that is it.
And the
I will
minority
now-
looks very forward to that, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Secretary, I'm delighted to see you, and even more delighted with the job that you're already doing at HUD. You know, you have made increasing production and access to affordable housing a priority for HUD's budget, and you've identified our severe shortage of affordable housing as a barrier to the home purchasing process. And as you know, since the financial crisis, private investors have focused much on real estate because of high yields. However, what I'm concerned about is that the private investors can often outcompete potential first-time home buyers. Some cite cumbersome FHA paperwork as slowing down the process for traditional home buyers, as well as making the rehab loan process expensive. So my question is, can you consider or look at streamlining the FHA loan process to put first-time home buyers in a better position to compete with private firms in the home purchasing process?
Absolutely, and we're doing that now by looking at a number of things. One is, HUD historically has not given a lot of small dollar loans. That's what people need to rehabilitate their homes. We are changing that. HUD has looked at credit in a way that we think has been unfair to persons of color or low-income or moderate home buyers, because we have weighted student debt differently than we have other debt. So we have created an environment in which people primarily who carry student debt, Black people, brown people, poor people, and moderate income people. So we have decided to weight that differently to allow people to really be creditworthy at this stage. We've also, in conjunction with our chair, looked at down payment assistance. So we are doing a lot of the things that you're requesting, and I'm just really happy that you brought it up. Thank you so much.
And I wanted to bring up, next one, because it's important, home ownership, in my estimation, in closing the wealth gap, which has been a priority of mine and a priority of this committee. And as you've just correctly stated, your key component of achieving that is helping individuals build up equity through home ownership. Again, because of the price of home skyrocketed, student borrowers, especially those of color, view home ownership as unattainable. And that's why, I am so happy that you've already taken on how you calculate student loan debt in its underwriting process to better reflect what student borrowers actually pay monthly, which is not often the sticker price, which gives them an opportunity to become homeowners, build, equity in their homes, and thereby closing the wealth gap. So that's so tremendously important. Maybe I should just ask you, can you just explain a little bit more how you're implementing that policy and your forecast of how impactful that change will be for student borrowers, and especially those of color?
Well, think about it this way, if I can just give you a very quick example. Prior to our making the change, a person that makes about $50,000 a year and has about $75,000 worth of student debt could not be approved for a house that costs $200,000,